Buna recapped for us what we've talked about the last few weeks, but I had also just a very brief recap where I just recap like one verse or quote from each of the sessions that helps me sort of remember what each one was about. So the first week was people were created to be loved and things were created to be used. The reason the world is in chaos is because things are being loved and people are being used. So there we learned about what's the problem with jealousy and what happens when our love and hate collide. In the second week, we heard about grasping for the wind, and the verse that I used to remember that is that Jesus says to his disciples, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. And so it was, sometimes when we're jealous for things, we're like, reaching aimlessly for something that we can't really have. And in doing so, we don't get that thing that we want, and we also feel really bad about it. And so we just need to be less preoccupied and concerned with those things that we can't have. Last week, the topic was God haters, and it was where we learned about how other people are jealous of us. And there was a very nice quote from the late Bishop Epiphanios, and he said, there are those who reach up to pull themselves up, but the truly enlightened ones lift others up without concern for themselves. And so the response to others being jealous of us was that we should allow that jealousy that they have where they want to lift themselves up. We should help them. We should help them and lift them up as well. Okay, so that brings us to this week. And I want to start off by asking you a question. What names does God give himself? Yeah, so there's 7 names of God actually. One of them is Yahweh, and we'll get into that. But there's a few other names that he gives himself, and we've heard some of them, and we're going to talk about one of them today. But whenever I hear about God's names, I always remember that famous line from Romeo and Juliet, what's in a name? That which we call a rose, by any other name would smell as sweet. Right? And whoever said that, whether it was Romeo or Juliet, I don't remember, but what they were trying to get at was like a name doesn't matter so much. But I would argue that a name is actually very important. It's the first thing that you learn about a person when you meet them, and it's how you form your judgment about someone else. And usually that first piece of information forms the first judgment. And then every other judgment you build upon. And so that first piece of information is very important. It leans you in a positive or a negative direction, and it really sets the stage for future interactions. So my parents had a great sense of humor. They would always tell me jokes when I was growing up, and once my dad figured out how to use Facebook, every week I would get these like Arabic memes from him that he would then have to explain to me and why it's funny. But the funniest joke that my parents ever made was giving me my name. They called me Rano. And I'll tell you why it's funny. So Rano is a Coptic word and it means beautiful. But my parents have never hesitated to tell me that I was an ugly baby. They even, at my wedding, the speech they gave, they spent half the time telling people I was an ugly baby. So it was funny that they named me beautiful. Clearly I wasn't. But they must have known that I would have had to explain this name every time I'd meet someone. They knew that this would sort of, make up the first 10 or 20 seconds of every new interaction I had with someone, is explaining my name, like, hi, my name is Rano. What's that? Ronald? No, Rano. Is that your real name? Yeah, it's my real name. So it's not a nickname? No, it's not a nickname. What does it mean? It means beautiful. And then they look at me all suspicious, and they're like, okay, nice to meet you, Ronald. So a name says a lot, okay? A name says a lot. And how does God introduce himself to us in the scriptures? So we heard one of them, which was Jehovah, but before Jehovah, God introduces himself right at the beginning of the scripture in Genesis 1:1 as Elohim. Okay, and Elohim is a Hebrew term that means strong one. And it was a term used for many of the pagan gods at the time, but God identified himself first and foremost as strong one. And then later in Exodus, he introduces himself in Genesis, he introduces himself in the second account of creation as Jehovah or Yahweh. That translates to Lord. And he later tells the Jewish nation in Exodus to remember his name, Jehovah. So he wants to be remembered as Lord, like on a more personal level. Now, later on in Exodus, he gives the Israelites another name that he wants to be called by. So if we look at Exodus chapter 34, verse 14, God is speaking here to the Jewish nation, and specifically to Moses, and he says, "Do not worship any other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God." And when you read this, you say, what? His name is jealous? Like, is that the name he picked? Like, why? Isn't jealousy a bad thing? Like, I automatically, when I hear jealousy, I associate it with a negative trait. Just to go back to another Shakespeare reference, in Othello, we hear that jealousy is the green-eyed monster, right? It's a bad thing. So why would God name himself jealousy? So let's just put this in some context before we, jump to conclusions. Remember, God is revealing himself to the Jewish nation and to us here. God is describing himself in a limited, inadequate vehicle, which is human language. Okay? So when he's communicating with us in human language, God has to work with that. Okay? He has to describe his unlimited, completely powerful, all-knowing, all-being self using this limited language. So that doesn't mean that when we interpret, what it does mean is that when we interpret God through our language here, we have to make allowances for who God is. So we don't try to limit God into the smallness of the words, but we try to stretch the words to fit God. And so to understand what God means here, let's take this in the context in which he says it and try to understand why he uses this word, jealous, as his name. So, let's set the stage. The Jewish nation leaves Egypt, goes into the desert, they're freed from their slavery, and now they have approached Mount Sinai, and they enter into a covenant, a promise, between them and God. And the promise is that God will do something for them, and in return, they will do something for God, and that is to worship him exclusively. So, Moses goes up into Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights to receive the law, the commandments from God, which are part of the covenant. And while he's up there, the Jewish nation forgets about him, right? They say, he's not coming back, let's just go at this on our own. And immediately they break the covenant, right? So they make this golden calf and they start to worship the golden calf. And while Moses is up there, this commotion starts to happen. God says, okay, these guys have already broken the covenant. I'm going to destroy them, and I'll start a new nation with you, Moses. And Moses pleads with him and says, no, don't do it. And God agrees. But Moses goes back down, gets really upset with the Israelites, and breaks the 10 commandments that he's received from God. And now he has to go back up to Mount Sinai and get the covenant again. Okay? So he has to go back up and get the covenant again, but first, God wishes to reveal himself to Moses as part of the covenant so that Moses and the nation of Israel know who they're getting into this agreement with. Okay? And so he introduces the covenant the second time with this. The Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents of the third and fourth generation. So God is re-entering this covenant where he is making promises and he is telling them, this is who I am. I am merciful. I am compassionate. I am gracious. I am slow to anger. I am forgiving. But I will also make sure that the guilty do not go unpunished. Okay? And in this context, he then tells them, be careful. Do not make a treaty with those who lived in the land where you are going, or they will be a snare among you. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, cut down their Asherah poles. Do not worship any other god, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. So that's the context in which he tells them that his name is jealous. Okay? It seems like he's trying to summarize everything he had told them previously when he picks that one word, jealous. And why jealous? Well, it sums up in one sort of emotion the full weight of God. So, God is jealous, yes, but not the same way that we are jealous. Okay? Nothing about us is 100% perfect, and nothing about God is less than perfect. So the jealousy of God is like human jealousy in some ways, okay? But the jealousy of God must also be unlike our jealousy in other ways, because it is God. So whatever the jealousy of God is, it's a perfect jealousy. And here, it sort of sums up all these other things that he said, that he's merciful, compassionate, forgiving, but also he seeks justice. So, let's talk about godly jealousy, okay? This jealousy that he refers to here as his name. And let's talk about the definition of jealousy here. So in Hebrew, the word for jealousy, the noun in the Old Testament, means to become dark red, okay? In the New Testament, the same word, which is written in Greek, means to boil, okay? So it gives the same sense, and it's translated into other words like zeal and jealousy, but it's used both when referring to God and to humans to mean to boil over. Okay, so if you've ever tried to make pasta and left it on the stove for too long, it boils over. Okay, and this verse from Proverbs really sort of highlights that for us. It says, "For jealousy is a husband's fury." Okay? It's like the dark red, that emotion that you could describe as dark red. It's this deep, passionate emotion that is an overflow. It's like a very strong emotion, primarily of possession. So the word jealous, as opposed to jealousy, which is the noun, jealous, in the Bible, in the Hebrew part of the Bible, is the word kana, and that word means it's sometimes translated in other translations as zeal, okay? Or it is the zeal to protect a possession or a relationship. So when it says God is jealous, what it's really saying is God has a zeal. He has a deep desire to preserve and protect something that is precious to him. So let's be clear then. God isn't jealous of us. He's jealous for us. Okay? Now that we know why his name is jealous and what he's jealous for, which is us and to protect us, what's the result of God's jealousy? Okay? What is our natural response to this jealousy? So the first response is exclusivity. Okay? And the second response is zeal. And we'll get into exclusivity first. So jealousy, we said, is God's name. And it is kind of the essence of God, right? He can't be anything other than jealous, because it's not a temporary thing for him. Because he's the highest and the greatest, and he's infinitely holy and glorious, he has to be zealous to preserve his honor and his supremacy. So he must desire exclusive devotion and worship from us. So to do less than that would make him less than God. And he even says about himself in Isaiah, I am the Lord, that is my name. I will not give my glory to another, nor my praise to graven images. So if we say that God is faithful, then he has to be faithful to himself and maintain his high and his holy position. And he wants us to attribute to him that degree of honor. Basically, that is what he's saying when he says in Ezekiel, I shall be jealous for my holy name. So let's bring that a little bit closer to home with a practical example. Marriage is the perfect practical example of this. In a marriage, a husband and wife enter into a covenant together where they are going to be exclusive to each other and not committed to anyone else, only to each other. So, if I'm married and my wife is dating other people, the only appropriate response that I could have to that is to be jealous, right? Because any other response to breaking of this exclusivity between us would mean that the marriage is meaningless, right? That there is no exclusivity. So, God often refers to the covenant he made with the Jewish nation and that he makes with us through Jesus Christ as a marriage covenant for the same reason, because we are to be exclusive to him. And if he is not jealous, then he denies that covenant. He is no longer faithful to it. And we can see here in James chapter 4, when James is trying to advise the people of God, he says, you adulterous people, don't you know that friendship with the world means enmity to God, against God? Therefore, anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. Or do you think Scripture says without reason that he jealously longs for the Spirit he has caused to dwell in us? So, God shows a passionate zeal to protect us and to give us his Spirit. That's how he is jealous and why he is jealous. Now, when you hear this, you think, well, God kind of sounds a bit insecure, right? If he's almighty and he's everything and he's omnipotent and all-powerful, why does he want us to worship only him? Why is he so insecure about our relationship with him? Why is he jealous? That's usually what we think of when we hear someone's jealous, right? Like, oh, I'm jealous that my wife is talking to another man. Like, why am I so insecure in my relationship? But it's not quite like that. God's jealousy isn't motivated by insecurity. It's motivated by the well-being of his people. So it's not like an inward jealousy of selfishness. It's an outward jealousy that's selfless. God knows that we will be insecure without him. And so that's why he's jealous for us. He knows that it's not good for us to be involved with anyone or anything other than him. So, the first response that we have to God's jealousy is to be exclusive to him. Now the second response. The second response is zeal. So during Jesus' time, the temple in Jerusalem was the center of Jewish life. God only came and encountered the nation of Israel in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, in the Holy of Holies. And so animal sacrifices were the only way that the people of Israel could be reconciled to God, and the only place they could offer those sacrifices was in the temple, which was in Jerusalem. So the temple had this monopoly on religion. And Jews from all over the world would come to the temple in Jerusalem to offer sacrifices and atone for their sins. Now, with this in mind, there were very specific criteria for sacrifices. You couldn't just offer up anything. You had to have a perfect sacrifice, a certain type of animal. They had to be without blemish, etc., etc., etc. There was all these very strict criteria. So if people are coming from all over the world, they're not going to be carrying their perfect, lamb with them from Greece all the way to Jerusalem. And so people started selling these perfect sacrifices in the temple courtyard, just outside the temple, which is still part of the temple. And that way it became kind of like a one-stop shop. You'd show up, pick your perfect sacrifice, go in, offer your sacrifice for atonement, and bim, boom, bam, you're done. But before you could buy that perfect sacrifice, you had to get temple dollars to buy the sacrifice. So you couldn't just use your own money. You had to first get special money only for the temple to use there. And so you had to exchange the money with the money exchangers who were there. And if you've ever looked at your credit card, anytime you exchange money, it costs something. And so, there's a monopoly on where you could sacrifice, there's a monopoly on where you could get the sacrifice, and there's a monopoly on how you get the sacrifice. And you can imagine with that much monopoly, people were taking advantage. Okay? And that kind of sets the scene for what happens when Jesus goes into the temple and he gets angry. Right? In the Gospel of John, Jesus goes into the temple and he said to those who sold doves, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise." Then his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house has eaten me up." And in the Gospel of Mark, we hear a slightly more detail to the story, that Jesus went into the temple, began to drive out those who bought and sold. He overturned the tables of money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. Now, I want you to keep something in mind. Christ's zeal here wasn't just a fit of rage. It wasn't something that just happened, right? It was deliberate. It was, almost sounds like it was planned. And it sounds like it actually took him some time to do it, right? You don't just go into the temple, drive out those who bought and sold, overturn the tables, throw their seats on the floor, all in a split second. That takes time. There's a process. And so Jesus is kind of laying out the blueprint for us here for how to have zeal, how to respond to God's jealousy with zeal. The first thing he does is he gets rid of what offends God, but he does it in a deliberate way, and it's a process. Okay? So, there's a great story in the history of the church that illustrates what I mean. And it's the story of the 40 martyrs of Sebastian. So there's these 40 soldiers living in the year 320. And they were all from a region in Turkey called Cappadocia. And they were members of this highly regarded Roman legion called the 12th Legion. And the emperor at the time, his name was Licinius. And he was emperor of the eastern part of the world, and then there was a western part. And he was starting to get really worried because it seemed like the western part was becoming very strong. And so he was becoming increasingly more stressed out. And he lashed out by having these very oppressive policies, specifically against Christians. And so to really solidify his strength and really make a show of force against his own people, he called on everyone in his army to demonstrate their support for him by offering sacrifices to the pagan gods of the time. And so most of the legion that these 40 men were a part of, they all complied as good soldiers would. But the 40 Cappadocians, they were all Christians, and they all respectfully declined. And they were all stationed very south around the Black Sea, or a city just south of the Black Sea. So it was a very cold area, and it was wintertime. So for more than a week, they were placed under guard, where they sang and they prayed together, and the captain pleaded with them, and he told them, of all the soldiers who serve the emperor, we like you guys, and we don't want you to do something where we have to hurt you. So, why don't you just turn our hatred back into love, and just do what you're told? And they replied to him, they said, "We have made our choice, we shall devote our love to our God." So one night at sundown, they're stripped of their clothes, and they're led out onto this frozen lake. And they're left there, and then they're surrounded by guards all around the lake. And just to make it a little bit more uncomfortable for them, they have this Roman bathhouse, like a warm, steamy bathhouse, set up on the side of the lake, so that if any one of them decides they're going to give up their faith, they can immediately go and warm up in the bathhouse. That night, they stand there all night, these 40 Roman soldiers, naked in the freezing cold on a freezing lake, and they sing, "40 good soldiers for Christ, we shall not depart from you as long as you give us life. We shall call upon your name, whom all creation praises. Fire and hail, snow and wind and storm, on you we have hoped and we are not ashamed." And as the night wore on, they kept singing this over and over, 40 good soldiers for Christ, and it got quieter and quieter because they were getting colder and colder. And then at midnight, something very interesting happened. One of the 40 staggered away from the lake and ran to the bathhouse. And the song immediately changed. 39 good soldiers for Christ, so on and so on. And the jailer watches the man enter, one of the soldiers standing around, watch this man enter the bathhouse, and then immediately come out of the bathhouse and just drop, because he just couldn't handle that sudden transition from hot to cold. And then the next thing that happened was that same soldier immediately went and joined the people on the lake, took off his clothes, and started yelling, 40 good soldiers for Christ. And so the number didn't change. They were still 40. Now, the next morning, of course, all 40 had expired. But when they were moving their bodies away, the captain came and recognized one of the guards was part of the 40, and he said, "What is he doing here?" And the other guards replied, "We can't understand it, but ever since those Christians came under his care, we noticed something different about him." So what this story illustrates is that these martyrs of Sebastia, they were zealous for God. They were zealous for the name of God, and they didn't want to go against it. And their zeal was a long, drawn-out, deliberate process. It didn't just happen like that. They went through it all night. And, most importantly, their zeal had a profound impact on the jailer. So our jealousy for God, our zeal for God, should also have a similar effect on the people around us. Now, to go back to that idea of how to carry out the zeal, we have to get rid of the things that offend God. And St. Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians to demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. So, what are these things that offend God that we have to demolish? These are the idols in our life. And these idols can be anything. They can be every thought, every behavior, everything that I hold in high regard ahead of God. It could be something as simple as my comfort. So I have a confession. I'm often late to church. Okay? I'm often late to church, and it's not because I have something to do on a Sunday morning. I don't have a meeting. There's no traffic, except maybe next week. The weather's usually fine. It's not the reason I'm late. It's usually because I'm sleeping. I hit the snooze button too many times. I stayed up too late the night before. And for me, that's an idol. It's something that comes in between me and God. It's something that I, on a Sunday morning, hold in higher regard than God. And so, in order for me to be zealous about tearing down this idol, I need to remember that I have to be deliberate and that it's a process. So how can I do that? Well, if it's going to be deliberate, then I have to make a plan. I'm not going to get over it by accident. There has to be a plan in place. So perhaps the plan is that I should sleep earlier. Perhaps the plan is that I should set more than one alarm. Perhaps the plan is that I should make a plan with someone else that I pick them up, and that forces me to be accountable to someone. And once I make that plan, it will then be a process to carry it out. Okay? So, let's remember that God is jealous for us to be exclusive to Him and to be zealous. And in order to be zealous, we need to get rid of what offends God. We need to be deliberate about it, and it's a process. And now I understand the title. Because it's a process, we need to move it along. Thank you.